Good morning. Ribhu Gita, chapter 21. Contemplation of Brahman, the Self. Verse 1. In order to strengthen and make changeless this knowledge of Brahman, the mass of bliss, I shall tell you again and again that there is nothing apart from the perfectly full non-dual Brahman. The, this picture that appears as the worlds and individuals is nothing but Brahman, which is consciousness alone. Is the silver that appears on the nacre anything different from that nacre? 2. There's nothing to say about the unreal worlds and jivas, as they are non-existent. There's nothing to say about the nature of Brahman, the reality, as it is the only one. Though the state of the truth is thus, as Brahman still remains the subject of discussion, I shall describe the one absolute for the benefit of those who practice to abide in Brahman. 3. The explanation of the exalted, undivided Absolute should be studied with an auspicious introduction. Only for those who study it in the proper manner shall the undivided knowledge arise, easily and in an unimpeded way within themselves. Hence, when the undivided Absolute is explained, it should be taught in the prescribed manner and procedure, with an auspicious introduction. 4. There are no worlds or individuals or the Supreme at all, apart from Brahman, the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss. All the worlds and individuals that seem to be are entirely the undivided Supreme Brahman indeed. Son, you, I, and all others are all of the nature of the perfectly full Supreme Brahman. I say this in the name of Shiva, the perfectly full and non-dual. There's not an atom of doubt of what I say. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is all. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is of the nature of knowledge. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which has none of all this. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is peace. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is peerless. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is infinite. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is defectless. Be in such ceaseless contemplation always. 6. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is the truth. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is motionless. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is eternal. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is taintless. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is pure. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is a mass of bliss. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is non-dual. Be deep in such contemplation always. 7. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is ancient. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is perfectly full. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which has no movement or non-movement. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is permanent. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is higher than the highest. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is without attachment. I am the Supreme Brahman, which is afflictionless. Be in such changeless contemplation always. 8. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is the limit of sound. I am the Supreme Brahman, which is beyond reach. I am the Supreme Brahman, which is the end of discussion. I am the Supreme Brahman beyond speech. I am the Supreme Brahman where ends knowledge. I am the Supreme Brahman beyond the reach of intellect. I am the Supreme to be comprehended through the Vedas. Be of this differenceless contemplation always. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is just itself. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which has nothing apart from it. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is full of reality. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is always bliss. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is blemishless. I am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is formless. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is all consciousness. Be of this sincere contemplation always. 10. I am of the nature of Brahman, spotless. I am of the nature of Brahman, undivided. I am of the nature of Brahman, without impurities. I am of the nature of Brahman, no modifications. I am of the nature of Brahman, no sense of mine. I am of the nature of Brahman, it cannot be measured by anything. I am the Supreme Brahman, which is unequaled. Be of this untiring contemplation every day. 11. I am of the nature that is not countable as 1, 2, and so forth. I am of the supreme nature, which is the knowledge of the fourth state. I am of the nature that has no I or mine. I am of the nature that is one, complete and full. I am of the nature that has no origin in the least. I am of the nature that has no birth, aging, and death. I am of the nature of the undivided Supreme, nothing apart from it. Be of such steadfast contemplation every day. 12. I am of the nature that is without bondage at any time. I am of the nature that has no liberation at any time. I am of the nature that is untouched by an atom of blemish. I am of the nature that has not a trace of opposing dyads. I am the existence that has nothing to perceive. I am the God that is just divine consciousness. I am the one supreme reality which is without a second. Be uninterruptedly of this contemplation always. 13. I am of the nature of the Supreme, which is of a single nature. I am of the nature that has no interior or exterior. I am of the nature of the Supreme, which is of the great space of consciousness. I am of the nature that is untouched even by a trace of fear. I am of the nature that is the complete, perfect fullness. I am indeed of the nature that is the settled conclusion of all. I am of the nature of the undivided Absolute without a second. Be of this continuous contemplation always. 14. I am of the nature of the Supreme, which is only consciousness. I am of the nature of the Supreme Shiva, which is full of consciousness. I am of the nature of the Supreme, which is all reality. I am of the nature which is ever a mass of bliss. I am of the nature which is merely that. I am of the nature which stands alone as itself. I am indeed the Supreme, which is all goodness. Be ever of this courageous contemplation without slipping. 15. I am of the nature that has no illusory forms. I am of the nature that has not an atom of action to be performed. I am of the nature that is wondrous form. I am of the nature that is undivided, supreme, and infinite. I am of the nature that is indicated by the word that. I am of the nature of the undivided absolute that is of the form or nature of itself. I am indeed of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which has nothing of the trivial. Be of this steadfast contemplation always. 16. Thought and other things never exist. All is of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is full of consciousness. Nothing truly exists, nothing at all. All is of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is reality. Duality does not exist at all at any time. All is of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is the One. I am that non-dual Supreme Brahman. Be of this steadfast contemplation always. 17. I am of the nature which transcends knowledge and such. I am of the nature of consciousness, which is perfectly full. I am of the nature that is ever motionless. I am of the nature that has no conditionings. I am of the nature that is the dietless non-duality. I am of the nature of the undivided Supreme, which is speckless. I am of the nature of the limitless Supreme Brahman. Be of this non-dual contemplation always. 18. I am of the permanent nature that is devoid of the triad of bodies. I am of the nature that is devoid of the deluding triad of states. I am of the nature that is devoid of the adhering pentat of sheaths. I am of the nature that is untouched by joy or sorrow. I am of the nature that is indescribable. I am of the nature of the Supreme, which is the one without a second. I am of the nature of the undivided Supreme, with nothing apart. Be of this non-dual contemplation always. 19. I am of the nature devoid of modes such as desire. I am of the nature devoid of muddled egoity. I am of the nature devoid of activities like Homa, fire sacrifice. I am of the nature that has not even an atom of result to be achieved. I am of the nature that is without name, other distinguishing characteristics. I am of the nature that has no differences of being manifold. I indeed am of the nature that cannot be described as yes or no. Be of this non-dual contemplation always. 20. I am of the nature devoid of any world or beings. I am of the nature that has no knower or knowledge. I am of the nature that has no differences such as time. I am of the nature that has no differences of regions to consider. I am of the nature devoid of any objects with form. I am of the nature that has no qualities, good or bad. I am of the nature of the undivided absolute without an abode. Be of this non-dual contemplation always. 21. I am of the nature that has no activities of the fickle mind. I am of the nature that has not an atom of doubt. I am of the nature that has nothing to see, even of the size of the smallest seed. I indeed am of the nature that exists as the seer. I am of the nature devoid of manifold differences. I am of the nature devoid of the world, the individuals, and the supreme. I indeed am of the nature of the unwavering, undivided absolute. Be of this non-dual contemplation always. I am Brahman, which is ever consciousness alone. I am Brahman, which is changeless consciousness alone. I am Brahman, which is consciousness alone without thought. I am Brahman, which is consciousness alone, without an identifying mark. I am Brahman, which is consciousness alone, without bondage. I am Brahman, which is consciousness alone, unbroken. I am Brahman, which is endless consciousness alone. Be of this non-dual contemplation always. 23. If you always courageously and continuously contemplate on the one absolute, you will become the supreme, the mass of existence, knowledge, bliss. You will rid yourself of all the sankalpas, the concepts and fixed ideas, and vikalpas, differences, doubts, and imaginations. And, becoming yourself the absolute, the void with the knowledge of that, and becoming your true self, all alone by yourself, be liberated from all bondage and worldly misery. There's not a shred of doubt about the exposition now given. This is certain. 24. If you have continuous, sincere contemplation of non-duality, you will enjoy the great bliss of that nature, rid of all doubts in your mind. To embrace this blissful nature, cast off all enervating connections and be merged in the undivided Supreme Brahman, which is not different from your immaculate self. 25. I am of the nature of Brahman, the reality. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is motionless. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is eternal. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is blemishless. I am of the nature of Brahman, which is pure. I indeed am of the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is a mass of bliss. Being always of this non-dual conviction is the merging in the undivided Supreme Brahman. 26. I'm never the body or the senses. I'm never the beings or mind. I'm never the intellect or thought. I'm never the ego. I'm never the primal ignorance underlying these. I'm never anything of this duality. I'm ever the non-dual Brahman. This conviction that I am Brahman is the indivisible merger. 27. I'm never the triad of bodies. I'm never the triad of states. I'm never the pentad of sheets. I'm never the experiencer of these. I'm never the integral, collective, or the discrete, the distinct. I'm never the world or the individual or the supreme. I'm ever the undivided Supreme Brahman. This conviction that I am Brahman is the indivisible merger. 28. As the undivided Supreme Brahman is the most intense reality of all realities, the union, the Sangha or association with the undivided Supreme Brahman has indeed been said by the enlightened to be satsang, association with the wise, the true, As the undivided Brahman is indeed the greatest of the great, the connection with that Brahman can indeed be said to be the great union of the enlightened. 29. The conviction that I am Brahman is the merging with reality. The conviction that I am Brahman is the merging with the great. The conviction that I am Brahman is the merging with the self. The conviction that I am Brahman is the undivided meditation. The conviction that I am Brahman is the undivided knowledge. The conviction that I am Brahman is the indivisible liberation. The conviction that I am Brahman is all. 30. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed be the meditation of the undivided Absolute. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed be the absorption in the undivided Absolute. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed be the knowledge of the undivided Supreme. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed be the undivided Supreme Self. 31. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed terminate the originless bondage of transmigration. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed confer the undivided liberation. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed end the endless spectrum of sorrow. If practiced continuously, the conviction that I am Brahman will itself indeed confer unsurpassed bliss. 32. Hence, with all determinations or uncertainties in your mind eliminated, by steadfastly, ceaselessly practicing every day the conviction that I am Brahman, you shall, free from sankalpa, fixed idea concept or concepts, and vikalpa, doubt, imagination, or difference, attain the knowledge of the differenceless, undivided Supreme Brahman, and enjoy infinite bliss. There is no travail or transmigration for those who enjoy such infinite bliss as stated here. 33. For those who, by tirelessly always practicing the conviction that I am Brahman, and getting rid of their mental delusions and enjoying endless undivided bliss, have become the embodiment of that limitless undivided Brahman. There's not even a trace of a change of lapsing again into the travails of transmigration. How can those who have become the bondageless, undivided Supreme Brahman pursue the travails of transmigration that duality develops? 34. What appears as I is of the nature of the self. What appears as another is of the nature of the self. What appears as the faulty mind is of the nature of the self. Whatever appears as whichever thought is of the nature of the self. What appears as the body is of the nature of the self. What appears as the various senses is of the nature of the self. What appears as all is of the nature of the self. The world, the individual, and the supreme are all of the nature of the self. 35. Egoity, which is inauspicious, is of the nature of the self. Intelligence and thought that arises are of the nature of the self. Desire that should be renounced is of the nature of the self. Covetousness and anger are of the nature of the self. Infatuation that arises is of the nature of the self. Arrogance, pride, and jealousy are of the nature of the self. All the modes of the mind are of the nature of the self. What is seen as real and unreal is of the nature of the self. 36. All the four defectless means are of the nature of the self. The guru and the disciple are of the nature of the self. The sextet of characteristics is of the nature of the self. The definition of the non-dual is of the nature of the self. The study of the crest of the Vedas is of the nature of the self. Reflection and contemplation are of the nature of the self. The fulfilling knowledge is of the nature of the self. The abiding liberation is also of the nature of the self. 37. The fickle superimposition is of the nature of the self. The triad of connections is of the nature of the self. The changeless true scriptures are of the nature of the self. The Anubandha, the four factors of philosophical work, subject, aim, relation, and for whom intended, are all of the nature of the self. The mighty worlds are of the nature of the self. The triads such as prarabdha, karma to be worked out in the present life, is of the nature of the self. Various types of forces are of the nature of the self. The samadhis, the states of absorption that are practiced, are of the nature of the self. 38. All ever is of the nature of the self. The changeless self indeed is of the nature of Brahman. Brahman indeed is of the nature of the exalted self. There's no difference, as above said. All is Brahman, the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss, which is not different from the self. One who has this identity firmly for himself will instantly be liberated from the bondage of worldly existence. 39. The practitioner of Brahman knowledge should ceaselessly practice what has just been stated here, that all the differentiated world, the individual and the supreme, are entirely Brahman, and I indeed am that Brahman. Having avoided all the misconceptions of the fickle mind, he should, by the strength of such helpful contemplation, avoid all misconceptions of the mind, and, giving up practicing even this, abide as the Absolute itself, bereft of any ideas. 40. Son, hence you should always be fully of this conviction, this bhava, and thereby removing all misunderstandings of thought, abide as the nature of the Supreme Brahman, which is consciousness alone. Not thinking in the least about anything else, abide as the void, permanently actionless. Removing even the thought that it is I who am ever the void here, abide as your own true self. 41. Remaining as one's natural self, beyond the reach of mind and words, casting off all thinking, is the complete liberation. If even an atom of thought creeps in otherwise, that thought itself will be the great bondage. The absorption that is totally free from thoughts is the true non-dual state. The absorption that is totally free from thoughts is the state of unsurpassed bliss. 42. Thought is the great sorrow. Thought is the great defect. Thought is that which is the endless variety of births. Thought is the intense fear. Thought is all the great sin. Thought is the irremovable anguish. Thought is the great knot of the heart. Thought, indeed, is all this duality. 43. Hence only he who has cast aside all kinds of manifold thoughts, by the conviction, the bhava, of being the undivided absolute, and having forgotten all recollections and prevented them from ever rising up, by means of such helpful conviction, bhava, and then being rid of such conviction, bhava, also, remains rid of all differences, as the truth transcending the mind, is the one who has attained differenceless, undivided, supreme liberation, free of all bondage. 44. It is only for those who have the undivided supreme bhava, the conviction, the attitude, I am Brahman, Brahman is myself, I am all, and not for those who have perceptions of the world and the supreme and such, that all fickle thoughts will disappear. Nidaga, for the benefit of all practitioners of Brahman knowledge, I have told you this truth of the firm definition of the undivided Absolute, as expounded by Digambara, clothed in space, Supreme Shiva. 45. This explanation of the undivided Absolute will pacify all thoughts of the world. This explanation of the undivided Absolute will pacify all sorrow. This explanation of the undivided Absolute will immediately confer the changeless bliss of liberation. One who hears and understands this explanation of the undivided Absolute will become oneself the Absolute. 46. Only by practicing the devoted meditation on the undivided Supreme Shiva will unsurpassed bliss arise. Without the least concept or difference or doubt, the completely quiescent mind alone will, merging with the one Supreme Shiva, attain true liberation. The mind that is agitated and subject to sankalpa, concepts, fixed ideas, or vikalpa, differences, doubt, imagination, shall never attain that state of liberation. 47. The great devotee of Shiva, with the daily contemplation that I am the undivided Supreme Shiva, will instantly rid of all the misunderstandings of the mind, become himself the Supreme Shiva, who is consciousness alone, and easily crossing this ocean of transmigration, attain the unique state of liberation. Thus the sage Ribhu clearly explained to Nidaga the subtle Absolute. 47. The great devotee of Shiva, with the daily contemplation that I am the undivided Supreme Shiva, will instantly rid of all the misunderstandings of the mind, become himself the Supreme Shiva, who is consciousness alone, and easily crossing this ocean of transmigration, attain the unique state of liberation. Thus the sage Ribhu clearly explained to Nidaga the subtle Absolute. That was the same verse again. 48. It is the infinite form of our Lord in a state of graceful, joyous dance that says, by the strength of the meditation, that I am the infinite, undivided absolute, thereby having all misunderstandings of the mind destroyed without a trace and released from all bondage, one can attain supreme liberation. And with this ends the 21st chapter of the Ribhu Gita. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.